Welcome to the Did Nothing Wrong podcast, where we cut through the noise and help you make sense of the chaotic information space around us. I'm Griff Somke. On this episode, political scientist Andy Vitek joins me to discuss just how realistic those worst-case scenarios for the 2024 U.S. presidential election we keep hearing about and seeing on social media really are. Stick around.
This is a crusade! This is a holy war against the deep state!
Where are the dictators? Where are the strong men?
Donald Trump is our instrument for retribution!
I'm going to fight for Christians. I'm going to fight for white people.
They have the Great Reset. We have the Great Awakening.
And why shouldn't I root for Russia? Because I am.
I want to see these people go through misery because of their grooming against our children.
After the assailant entered the home asking, "Where's Nancy? Where's Nancy?" Those are the very same words used by the mob when they stormed the United States Capitol.
I did nothing wrong.
Well, it's been a week for sure. We saw a presidential candidate very nearly get assassinated. And I think the thing that surprises me the most is that it was Trump. Because while you see a lot of hate for the guy, among others on the right, you just don't see as many people acting on it like that. I mean, it happens once in a while, like the Steve Scalise shooting from a few years ago, but most of the time the political gun violence is coming from the right. Because gun culture is nowhere near as much of a thing on the left either. And I'm going to go out on a limb here and say most people I know on the left have very mixed feelings about guns at best. And we can talk all day about whether or not that should change and whether or not the left should embrace gun culture, but as of now, most of the people I know who are really into guns are definitely on the right. So I'm not surprised that the shooter profiles as a conservative, but I'm somewhat surprised at his target selection. And meanwhile, the polls didn't seem to change a whole lot as a result of this. In fact, the polls seem to be extremely weird this year. You're seeing stuff like young people favoring Trump, which just does not line up with how the kids vote ever. And you're seeing stuff like Biden running ostensibly 10 points behind senators in the same state, even after a debate performance that was widely perceived as disastrous and sparked calls from congressmen, podcasters, huge chunks of the media for Biden to drop out. The numbers just haven't changed a whole lot. So we're in a really strange place right now as a country. So many of us, like regardless of where we stand politically, are absolutely black-pilled about the election and what the future holds. And it's not like one side has it worse than the other, because both sides are actually pretty bad on this right now. So, Andy, you study this stuff as well as teach it, and you're far more qualified to talk about this than I am. What do you think we're looking at here and going forward?
I mean, that really is the question of the day, right? And I think we all kind of owe it to ourselves to take a collective breath and kind of try to look as soberly as we can at what realistic possibilities might actually look like for the next 6 months or so.
Right.
And I really feel like a lot of the commentary has kind of left that path behind pretty heavily over the past couple of months, seeing a lot of emotion, not a lot of analysis, and it's understandable, right? People are scared, they're uncertain, and that is a top-notch black-pilling cocktail if ever there was one. But I do think we, especially those of us who try to inject some degree of analysis and expertise, definitely owe it to ourselves and the people who are, going out of their way to potentially listen to us to try to reorient the discussion somewhat.
Right. And just a quick word, I think about most of the people that listen to this podcast know what I'm about to say, but I want to talk for a minute about what we mean when we use the word pilled. Some of you have heard the phrase red pilled, right? Generally given to mean taking in the culture of MAGA, of men's rights activists, of 4chan, et cetera, et cetera. This started becoming slang in like the early teens. It became a big thing in the 2010s, run up to the election in 2016. And there's many ways that people use that phrase, pilled. Red pilled is that. Blue pilled is like you're a normie. You are basically content with the status quo and happy. That's the way they're usually phrasing it. Black pilled, which you're going to hear us probably say at least more than once, means that you think things are just fucked and there's no coming back from any of this because the whole system is screwed, society is awful, we're going to get another 4 years of Trump, we're all going to die, forget it. White pilled is kind of the opposite of that, which means you think everything's going to be okay. You see some, some hope in the future on some of this. And it just goes on from there. So like I said, I think pretty much everybody knows that, but I wanted to be clear just so we're not being a little too inside baseball, in case you don't spend as much time on the Twitters as we do. God bless you. You are obviously one of the chosen at that point.
Yeah, you are far wiser than we are in a lot of ways.
Right. So you said you've kind of drawn some stuff up about what the next 6 months might end up looking like if we end up with, well, let's walk us through it.
Yeah. So, talking about what a potential second Trump term might look like, because I feel like a lot of the conversations tend to focus on, okay, this is what's on the line in November. This is what may come to pass if we get another 4 years of a Trump administration. And I do think there are a number of scenarios that are worth, walking through in some detail, evaluating in terms of how likely they are. I do think a few addendums are pretty necessary. The first of them being that while I may describe some of these scenarios as better or worse, let's be clear, these are all bad.
Right.
Even a best case scenario for a second Trump administration would result in a spectrum of bad outcomes for a lot of people, especially for more like members of vulnerable communities, whether we're talking about LGBTQ people or immigrants. While I may describe some of these scenarios as a best case scenario, a better or worst case scenario, let's also be clear that, we're talking about a selection of bad outcomes. Some may be better or worse, but they're all bad.
And nobody associated with this wants that. Nobody wants that even in the slightest. So
yeah, all of these scenarios are to be avoided if at all possible. We should focus on avoiding them if we can.
Yes.
The second thing, given that, a lot of discussions about possible trajectories tend to hinge on drawing on various, comparison cases, things like this. And I think this is so important when discussing really any contemporary case of, potential democratic decay or power accruing to a far right reactionary movement. When we're doing this kind of analysis, we have to try our best to leave the cases of 20th century fascist regimes behind us.
Right.
Especially the case of Nazi Germany, which everyone wants to talk about, everyone wants to draw connections to. But the fact of the matter is that the case of Nazi Germany is just not all that informative and instructive in terms of how contemporary far-right reactionary movements operate. It's not instructive in terms of how modern authoritarian regimes operate. And for all of the, comparisons you can draw between, the MAGA movement and the Nazi Party, there are half a dozen other very crucial differences that really make that comparison not particularly useful.
Right.
Analytically speaking, it's an understandable instinct that a lot of people have, just because that tends to be the worst possible right-wing outcome people can imagine. And it's also one of the only historical cases that people tend to know a lot about. So,
Right.
I understand why people's minds immediately go to okay, this is going to be another Nazi Germany, when really there's not a whole lot of evidence that anything remotely similar to that would happen here. I recommend you, there are so many great books written by academic historians that will detail exactly why that is the case, and I won't belabor any of those points.
And we've had a bunch of them on the program, so
go listen to some previous episodes of the Did Nothing Wrong podcast if you want to learn all about it.
Right. Again, it's going to look like its own thing. It's definitely going to have elements of other things that we've seen, but the reason people make that comparison, as far as I can tell, is because we like to put things in boxes. And that's a box that we're all kind of familiar with. So
yes, exactly. So along those lines, the first scenario of a second Trump term, and the one that I think is informing a lot of the doom spiraling, right, is this scenario of a second Trump term essentially leading to the total democratic breakdown of the United States, the U.S. Republic transitioning to some sort of right-wing Christian nationalist authoritarian state. The 2024 election is the final election,
right.
Vote now because you'll never get a chance. And for as much as I see this scenario talked about, I honestly think that the likelihood of something like this happening is while not impossible, is so low that it barely is even worth considering. Largely because that when we look at how modern authoritarian regimes function, I mean, even authoritarian strongmen like Vladimir Putin are not able to completely dispense with democratic processes and specifically elections. It is very rare that we can find an authoritarian state in 2024 that is able to completely discard even the barest trappings of democracy. Now, obviously, those democratic institutions are not going to function as they are meant to do so, right? We can talk about whole spectrums of electoral manipulation, the suppression of opposition, etc. But the fact of the matter is that most authoritarian states still are forced to lean on elections, political parties, political mobilization. So the idea that within the span of 4 years, we would see a complete and total meltdown of all formal national democratic structures, to me, just seems incredibly unlikely. Again, nothing's impossible. I'm not going to say anything is completely off the table, but based on everything we've seen over the past really 30 years or so, especially with how various other, again, right-wing, reactionary, populist-fueled movements and parties have operated, whether these are parties in Europe, Asia, South America, United States. We have a very rich number of case studies here. We cannot point to really a single instance of just complete democratic liquidation.
And I think the one thing that's likely to come up and that I want to point out is that when we have seen a lot of states slide into that level of autocracy, like I'm thinking El Salvador here recently under Bukele, the thing is they're not coming from where the United States is coming from as a country. They're coming from a much worse scenario and a much worse situation. And a lot of the people are just simply so fed up that there is a majority for that kind of rule. And, you see it in Russia too. You think about like a guy like Vladislav Surkov, who's the guy who came up with the idea of managed democracy. The idea that we're just going to do the whole thing like a theatrical production. And yes, you'll be able to vote for the opposition as long as the opposition is somebody we say that you can actually be opposed by. And again, they didn't get there overnight. They had years under the Soviets, then a brief period of maybe elections that weren't completely rigged, and then Putin took over. So we're not talking about countries here that have a strong tradition of democratic institutions and the rule of law for the most part that ended up in that situation.
Absolutely. And especially going back to, we look at the rare cases we can point to contemporarily of, again, total democratic breakdown. They tend to be, right, exceptionally weak states,
right?
States that do not have a lot of internal capacity, states that have institutions that both do not function well and lack the ability to deliver any kind of political goods. They are unable to do any kind of large-scale grassroots mobilization. Yeah, these are states that were never in any way, shape, or form healthy or competent. So, again, meaningfully comparing them when we have, again, all these other extant cases of fairly robust states
right
going through similar processes, I think we have more than enough evidence to say that the total democratic collapse scenario is, if not completely off the table, then not barely even worth discussing in a lot of ways, just because I think the likelihood is so low. And in many ways, I do think this is one element where even the conservative iterations of American nationalism, I don't think would be capable of completely discarding electoralism.
Right.
I think that would be a very, very difficult thing to accomplish. Again, I'm not saying any of these things are impossible, but, throwing out presidential elections.
Yeah.
Sure. There is, of course, a wing of the conservative MAGA movement that would absolutely get behind that. But I would say for the majority of the Republican Party, that would be a hard, if not impossible sell.
Yeah, and especially if you're talking about keeping the United States together in its current form, because just being blunt, there's no way that's going to fly out here on the West Coast, where I'm from, period. It just isn't. It's not going to fly in most of the large urban centers in this country. you would end up with so much in the way of just strife, absolute civil strife trying to enforce this. It would, nobody wants this.
Exactly. Yeah. So while, that kind of, again, doomerism can be really good for getting some traction on social media, I think, again, it's not really a scenario worth seriously dwelling on. Again, it's easy to get traction because it's scary. It's the worst thing anyone can think of. And so, when you're in this situation where you're already tending towards like, well, bad things are happening, so we need to expect the worst at all times. This is an instance where I think, the worst thing on the table is not really on the table.
Okay. Well, that makes a lot of sense because it's easy to get caught up in the hyperbole. It's easy to get caught up in this is it, they're going to end it. And when you have comments like, Trump's jokes about being a dictator on day one, and it's easy to put all that together and think, wow, we're heading for someplace really, really bad. But he still has to somehow enforce that. And the will just isn't there.
Yeah, exactly. And we can definitely be heading towards someplace bad that doesn't result, in this total liquidation of American democracy.
Right.
Which, again, that would be such a hard sell.
Mm-hmm.
And just so difficult on so many levels. I don't think it's worth really losing any sleep over that, at least. Yeah. So I think we can safely put that one aside and say, okay, nightmare fuel though it may be, we're probably okay.
Right.
So what I see as the worst case scenario that is actually feasible would be essentially a significant erosion of federal democratic institutions. So this is where we start talking about, Project 2025, various aims that they have where we don't see the liquidation of democratic processes and institutions, but effectively they are sufficiently weakened and the GOP and American conservative movement is effectively able to, stack the deck in various ways that, doesn't give them absolute political power by any means, but bakes in enough electoral and institutional advantages to the point where meaningfully competing against them becomes exceptionally difficult. This would have the US going down a path similar to, countries like Hungary under Viktor Orban, Poland, and getting into this space of what political scientists call either hybrid regimes or competitive authoritarianism, these states where you have democratic processes, regular elections, all of the trappings of democracy, but the existing incumbents manipulate them to the point that gives them pretty significant advantages. Now, that doesn't mean those advantages can't be overcome. Very notably, the Law and Justice Party in Poland lost an election last year when everyone thought that Poland was very clearly going down this heavy route of democratic backsliding. Of course, Modi and the BJP just ate one of their biggest electoral losses in a decade in India. So it's important to note that even when these efforts are successful, it doesn't completely wall off competition. Now, that's not to say you want to go down this path by any means, but this to me, I think, represents probably the most feasible worst case scenario. Where a second Trump administration is able to engage in serious bureaucratic and regulatory capture, effectively able to, vacuum out all of the major civil services, replacing them all with various loyalists, potentially put in place new regulatory institutions that will allow them to hamstring and potentially limit political opposition. So, for instance, in Hungary, one of the major things that Orban's party did was institute this governmental media regulatory body that effectively served as an instrument for, targeting media outlets that were critical of Fidesz and Viktor Orban. Not necessarily, engaging in pure dictatorial oversight, but again, providing various bureaucratic and legalistic tools that can create these various kinds of advantages.
You make their lives harder.
Yeah, and when you have when elections are close, as they have been for quite some time in the U.S., those differences can matter. Right. Like, just because the opposition is capable of winning doesn't mean they're going to be able to fight through all of these bureaucratic, legal, and administrative roadblocks that the incumbent administration is able to put in front of them.
Right. And it basically stacks the deck. It doesn't necessarily mean you can't still win. It just means that it's going to be a whole lot harder. And when you go into this with as much of the apparatus as is already weighted towards that side, like, you almost have to put the Supreme Court in there already, that anything that goes there is probably going to end up in favor of that side.
Yeah, that's hard to say. I mean, it's important to keep in mind that, like, back in 2020, everyone was assuming that when Trump would make his inevitable case about voter fraud, the Supreme Court would be, throwing out absentee ballots in Pennsylvania. But, this very same court sent him packing in 2020. Now, does that mean the same thing is going to happen again? By no means. But, we do have at least, a pretty significant case where, the Trump campaign threw a whole lot of legal resources trying to get some traction in 2020 in terms of trying to disqualify ballots and just throw as many. They were throwing everything at the wall and seeing what would stick, and the Supreme Court wasn't having any of it. So
right.
That is at least something to keep in mind. That doesn't necessarily mean they're going to act in the same way in similar circumstances. But I do think there isn't enough information for us to say, like, okay, yeah, in the event of a contested election in 2024, the Supreme Court is going to rule in Trump's favor no matter what. We don't know that. Is it possible? Sure. But I don't think we have enough information to assume that.
Yeah, and that's what I think a lot of people are basing that on, is the idea that, you have essentially a 6-3 conservative majority over there. 3 of them were Trump appointees. Yeah. And I think people just sort of assume that this is how it's going to go.
That's a very imperfect assumption, right? The assumption that every justice appointed by a given president is going to rule in that person's favor? No, that's absolutely not the case. We've actually seen a couple of times where Trump's appointees on the court have actually ruled against things that he really liked. I know Coney Barrett, especially, I think, as well as Gorsuch in various instances, have assuming that they would be in the tank for any conservative or Trump-favored proposal that has not lined up.
Right.
We've seen them make plenty of horrible decisions, but we can't just assume that, anytime Trump gets in front of the court, those 6 are going to be in the bag for him. So,
and if you look at the history of the Supreme Court, this is not exactly uncommon. I mean, as much as it looks terrible right now, and part of the reason it looks so terrible is because you've got guys like Clarence Thomas and Alito that are really shitting up the place in terms of the perception that this is a completely biased and in the tank court. You go back and you look at things like, the Nixon decision on whether he had to turn over his tapes or not, and it was 9-0 against him. And a lot of those were Nixon appointees, but it didn't matter. So I think you're probably right about that when it comes down to it, they're going to rule the way they should rule on these things.
Potentially. Yeah. I think especially those rulings that kind of get at the core, because when we think about, so for instance, the more recent, like, egregious rulings, whether the ones about, presidential immunity or, in my opinion, the far worse Chevron decision.
Oh, yes.
God, like, I hate that so many people were focusing on the presidential immunity one when I think the Chevron decision is infinitely more damaging, but that's, put a pin in that.
Yeah.
Both of those decisions are pretty in line with conventional conservative Republican views of the federal government and the scope of the governmental regulatory apparatus. Like, that didn't strike me as potentially out of step with what we've seen from kind of conventional Republican jurisprudence for the last 30 or 40 years, especially the Chevron decision. I mean, the Republicans have been wanting to gut the administrative state for half a century. That is not, I think, a sign that we're seeing, like, authoritarian drift. And, the immunity decision, that in a lot of ways just kind of upholds the status quo that's always kind of existed with presidents, and that presidents have never really been seen as legally liable for official actions taken in the course of office. At least it's never been tested legally until now. But yeah, circling back around, I do think this probably represents, again, the most feasible worst case scenario. But even so, when we compare the US to, again, cases in Europe that I think are probably most immediately analogous, again, a case like Hungary, Poland, etc. I do think the US also has a number of various structural characteristics that would make it harder to do here than it was to do there. The biggest of that being the nature of the US federal system and the full scope of powers that state governments are able to exercise in opposition to the federal government. The fact that at the end of the day, the highly decentralized nature of American elections makes large-scale, centralized electoral manipulation extraordinarily difficult.
Yeah.
It's important to remember that most democracies around the world, it's not localities and state governments that are running elections. Elections are run at the top. Likewise, the ways in which various statewide races are run. So, right after Fidesz and Orban took power and got their constitutional supermajority, they pushed through this, insane gerrymander of the entire Hungarian electoral map. And obviously, we have plenty of gerrymanders here. But of course, that is the purview of state governments, not the federal government. And also, gerrymanders ultimately don't really affect statewide vote counts.
No, they don't.
Yeah, they don't. So the election of senators, the election of governors, the president, especially in more parliamentary oriented systems where fundamentally the legislative vote shares are going to determine the entire governmental power structure. That's only going to give you a few of the keys here.
Yeah.
And so, pushing through a similar type of, assault on centralized democratic structures in the case of the US, again, would not be impossible, but it would be, I think, significantly more difficult than even more contemporary examples that we've seen more recently. Again, like Hungary, like Poland, and other cases we've seen in Eastern and Central Europe in particular.
And a lot of states would push back on it. It is the answer to what you were saying about it being so much of the state's purview for how elections get taken care of. Everybody always asks that question. Most of the time, it's not in particularly good faith because the answer is kind of obvious. How come so-and-so country can count all the ballots within 24 hours of them being cast? And it's like, well, because it's one central authority counting all the ballots.
Yep.
You have 50 states plus a couple of territories in this country.
Yep. And every single one of them have different rules of how they do it. I mean, hey, I live in Pennsylvania, and for some asinine reason, Pennsylvania is not even allowed to start counting mail-in and absentee ballots until Election Day, which is just absolutely absurd.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, yeah, every single state has its own rules, its own regulations of how ballots need to be handled. And yes, while that can make coverage and, the inevitable wait for electoral results annoying and heartburn inducing, it does make federal capture of electoral processes very, very difficult.
Right. I live in Washington and we have that same silly rule about not counting. However, we do everything mail in.
Yes.
So it's a lot simpler to tabulate at that point because we just bring the sacks of mail and we open them and we count up all the votes.
Yeah. But it is important to note that even though this potential scenario, going down the lines of a successful implementation of the various elements in Project 2025, while I doubt would be able to, replicate the results we've seen, for instance, in Eastern Europe, this would still be extraordinarily bad, primarily because it would essentially completely gut the regulatory state and the federal bureaucracy as we know it. It would provide so many new and potentially horrible tools to the administration when it comes to enforcing any number of draconian, unethical, or straight up illegal law enforcement measures, for sure.
Right.
And, we get into a similar type of contested election January 6th type situation that can potentially be the difference maker. So that's primarily why I see this as definitely the worst case of the feasible scenarios, because this can, in effect, result in even more structural advantages for a party that already has a huge amount of structural advantages.
Absolutely.
Yeah, whether we're talking about the basic structure of the Senate, various forms of, or just the general approach to political representation here, absolutely favors the Republican Party and has for a long time. And, there's definitely, certainly the potential that could get a lot worse in a second Trump term if they are able to sufficiently focus their efforts in terms of knowing which institutions to prioritize, the types of employees that they want to replace. Because, this is not something that's ever going to be able to happen overnight.
No,
right?
definitely
Like,
not.
we're talking about tens or hundreds of thousands of federal and bureaucratic employees. This is
Right.
a project that would play out over the course of years, not weeks or even months. And I fully expect that it would run into various legal challenges that would probably slow things down. But yeah, this would be bad. This would be very, very bad, and has the potential to have very nasty anti-democratic consequences for significant years down the road.
So, what do you see as a more likely scenario to happen? Like, in your mind, what would you say is the most likely thing to happen in the event of a Trump win in November?
Yeah, so I keep going back and forth on this. So the other two scenarios that I think are on the table realistically, so we've got this relative success by the GOP and a Trump administration of degrading various democratic institutions. Next level down, I would see as kind of like a retread of the first term, where various attempts by the Trump administration or a second Trump administration run into various problems, obstructions, and while damage is dealt, a lot of their efforts get stymied by either the overall structure of existing institutions or just, lack of being able to get the right people in the right places. And at the far end, the best case scenario would be that or at least in my mind, a potential emphasis to essentially prioritize Trump loyalists at any cost, which the nomination of J.D. Vance as VP certainly indicates that that's kind of the road they're taking.
Oh, yes.
Essentially has the potential to, hamstring the administration just with sheer incompetence.
Right.
Because if all you're doing is stacking with loyalists, turns out loyalists tend to be really bad at their jobs.
Mm-hmm.
And when so many of their goals or the potential goals of a Project 2025 or similar type of approach will require, fairly skillful navigation and understanding of the federal institutional structures, you actually need people who know what they're doing in there.
Yeah.
Again, the Heritage Foundation being involved in this definitely makes me believe there will be some expertise there.
They have it.
Yeah, they have it. But if we just see an entire Trump administration stacked with a bunch of sycophants, there's definitely a potential that you just end up hiring all of the wrong people, and the collective weight of sheer incompetence effectively kneecaps the entire administration. Now, I don't know how likely that is. Again, I think it's in the cards. Because again, the fact that someone like J.D. Vance was tapped as VP indicates that Trump clearly wants loyalists around him because, at least in my mind, as a VP candidate, Vance is all liability with no upside whatsoever.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, if I had been picking the Republican vice presidential candidate from anybody who was actually realistic, I'd have picked Vance because I want them to lose.
Yeah. I mean, he's a senator from a state that Trump's going to win already, and he's a terminally online weirdo with stances and takes that are going to be really hard for them to defend.
Yeah. He does nothing to bring out anybody who wasn't already voting for the MAGA party at this point.
He only appeals to people who were already in with Trump. Like I think it was a massive tactical mistake.
Right. And the more people hear of him and of his policies, the less they like him.
Oh, sure. Yeah. Like I know there's already the clip of, him saying that, women should be forced to stay in abusive marriages for the sake of children. I'm like, yeah, that clip is going to be airing wall to wall in every suburban swing state market for the entire month of November.
As it should.
As it should. Yes, exactly. So I do think that is definite evidence that, Trump and his team are prioritizing personal loyalty above all else. And that's not a good recipe for getting the kinds of expertise that something like Project 2025 is going to need. That's going to make things harder for them. Now, does that mean that they're doomed to failure? By no means at all. But I do think it does indicate that this idea of being just kind of smothered by their own incompetence is certainly possible. It's in the cards. As far as what's the most likely of all of these. Oh, yeah. And also, we also need to consider what I'll refer to as the wild card scenario. There is a perfectly reasonable, and I think, not unfair likelihood that Trump would die in the course of his second term.
Exactly. And you can talk about, Biden being old and Biden being on the wrong side of it, but Trump's only a few years younger.
Yeah. Like, Trump is an old, unhealthy man.
Mm-hmm.
Like, the likelihood that he may just die of natural causes in the next 4 years if elected president again. And yeah, let's not forget, the presidency, doesn't matter who you are, takes a horrific toll on you.
Oh, yeah.
It takes a terrific toll on you. So, and if that were to happen, I mean, it's anybody's guess as to how, if, let's say, in 2026, Trump dies. I couldn't even begin to speculate as to what would happen there, because I do think, when we talk about any scenario of a second Trump term, I think it's so important to stress that Trump's current coalition right now is incredibly fragile.
Oh, yes.
It is so fragile, because interestingly, as we've seen, Biden's polling positions, take a pretty significant hit, that hasn't translated into higher favorables for Trump.
No.
His approval and his favorability ratings have been more or less static since he left office. They haven't gone anywhere. And any motion has more or less just been within any kind of statistical margin of error.
Right.
So, he hasn't really built his popularity, and the collection of various groups and interests that he has put together right now don't like each other very much.
No, they do not. And if you look at some of the social media statements from people like Nick Fuentes in the wake of the JD Vance pick, man, he is living. Guy is beside himself.
The entire fasci wing of the MAGA movement have been completely apoplectic over JD Vance, because he's married to a non-white woman and has biracial kids, which is hilarious.
His wife isn't a Christian.
Oh my God.
It's amazing.
I haven't even watched the RNC, just watching these various meltdowns from some of the worst people imaginable has been great. And, there are protests going on at the RNC by pro-life activists because Trump insisted on stripping the national abortion ban out of the party platform.
Mm-hmm. Uh-huh.
Yeah.
And you wonder, what he was thinking on this, because nobody who's followed his first term believes that wasn't kind of the plan at all. So why did he decide that he needed to try and tack to the center and make people like Tony Perkins mad?
Yeah, that's a good question. My initial guess would be that, he has enough tactical acumen to see that reproductive rights have been far and away the GOP's biggest vulnerability since the Dobbs decision, given that, especially when we look at what has been motivating a lot of Democratic turnout and driving a lot of, let's be real, Democratic overperformance, whether we're talking about the 2022 midterms or all of these various special elections, a lot of it is seen as being motivated pretty heavily by the Dobbs decision and the potential assault on women's reproductive health care. Yeah, I think tactically it makes a lot of sense. I think Trump probably imagines that, it's not like the pro-life people are going to go vote for Biden. And I think he assumes that he can just piss off as many as he needs to, and they'll still ride with him, which isn't necessarily untrue. I think that as far as strategic gambles go, is probably a pretty safe one.
Yeah, but the idea of whether he can actually sell this to anybody. I mean, he is one of the world's greatest salesmen. I will give him that. But the idea that you can somehow take credit for the Dobbs decision, take credit for abortion being off the table in a lot of places in this country for a couple of years after you leave office in campaign speeches, and then all of a sudden you're now a moderate on this.
Yeah, it definitely seems like a pretty ludicrous needle to thread.
Right.
I think, at least my guess is that Trump thinks that people's memories are short enough that, he'll be able to stake out some sort of a pseudo moderate position on this. Because again, it's not like he personally has any ideological stance on this, right? He's engaging this on a purely political level.
Right.
So again, I think it's probably just him looking at this, or at least his team saying, we need to at least have some sort of a backstop against the various attacks that are going to be coming at us front and center about Dobbs, about abortion access, about women's reproductive health care in general. And maybe they think that this will at least help them blunt them a little bit, or at least kind of take the edge off. And I don't know, maybe they're right. It's hard to say. I definitely, as we said, I don't think that as annoyed as I'm sure a lot of pro-life activists are, I'm sure it's not going to annoy them enough to stay home.
Yeah.
Most likely.
They
can't
don't,
imagine that it
generally.
would. No, they don't. Yeah, these are the singlest of single issue voters.
Oh, absolutely they are.
Yeah, they are some of the most electorally engaged people and have been for 40 years. So again, on that front, I don't see it as a particularly risky gamble on Trump's part, but I have to imagine that that's probably the motivation behind it. And again, he's going to have to contend with the fact that, a Trump victory would likely involve him improving his numbers with non-white voters compared to 2020. If the polls are accurate, it would certainly seem that he has grown his numbers there. And that adds another piece of a potential Trump coalition that will also complicate things. Right?
Yes.
The hardcore Christian nationalist side of the coalition is going to be pushing for very specific things, whereas potential gains among Black or Latino voters, they're primarily going to be interested in economic proposals, right?
Right.
They very likely are going to be motivated by inflationary pressure on food, fuel, and housing, and various other economic arguments that Trump is going to be able to. So that's, as far as being able to deliver on the non-economic side of the policy house, that's going to be tough with any coalition that would bring Trump into office a second time.
Right. And like you said, the coalition is very fragile, and he's relying on some groups that historically haven't turned out in the numbers that some of the groups that he's managed to alienate do.
Sure.
I mean, it really starts to seem like they're flying the white flag about suburban women.
It sure seems that way.
And they vote.
They vote, man.
They vote.
It's funny. I see so many people, kind of spinning these tales about 2020, saying, "Oh, it was the youth vote that came out and put Biden in office." No, it was not. It was the absolute collapse of the Republican Party in the white suburbs.
I think that people don't quite get just how out women are on this guy. Yeah. Talk to any woman in your life and ask them what kind of vibe they get from Trump and see what they say. Yeah. It's very much we're not into this guy on any level whatsoever.
Yeah. And I always like to point to the fact that, Trump did better in 2020 in major urban centers than he did in 2016. He overperformed with non-white voters compared to 2016. But again, what happened was that old school kind of George W. Bush era coalition between essentially the evangelicals and suburban whites was broken. And we just saw, again, a complete and total collapse of that historical and pretty consistent Republican support within the predominantly white suburbs around major urban areas. So those collar counties in Pennsylvania.
Yep. The east side of King County and Seattle area.
Maricopa in Arizona, all those places. Yeah, that was what made the difference. And we haven't seen a lot of evidence that Trump has been able to repair his standing with those voters.
And Vice President J.D. Vance is not going to bring those people back into the fold. No way.
Not a chance. Absolutely not a chance.
If he was shooting for that, he'd have done better with Tim Scott. He'd have done better probably even with Marco Rubio.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Any of these people.
Yeah. Someone who at least can pass off as an adult. But yeah, again, as we said, J.D. Vance is a terminally online weirdo. And he just gives the weirdest vibes, says the weirdest stuff.
I mean, he didn't make the shooting guns in the desert commercial like his fellow Peter Thiel backed candidate Blake Masters did in 2020. True.
And we all know how things ended for Blake Masters.
Oh yes.
He got absolutely dismantled.
So really, I think that was a bad call on their part. They really should not have done that. It doesn't help their cause whatsoever.
Yeah, and I do think, because, it is important to keep in mind, too, that as much as we talk about kind of the mainstream coalition, we can't forget, right, about, the hardcore extremist fringe of the party that is still there, that has grown in representation. I think people are finally starting to figure out that while like Gen Z numbers wise is not conservative at all, but the conservative part of Gen Z is incredibly conservative.
Oh, yes. Oh, yes.
Like they all have Groyper accounts. They are effectively fascists.
Mm-hmm.
Like the conservative wing of Gen Z is hyper right wing. Yeah, and a lot of them now are starting to get jobs in congressional offices. They are staffers.
Oh, absolutely.
The amount of influence that they stand to have in Washington is somewhat terrifying. But again, this also gets into, again, this very fractious nature of the coalition, not just broadly speaking, but within, that far right wing itself. I know you and I have talked about this, and various other guests on the podcast have too, that if there's one thing that, far right and fascist groups hate than their actual stated enemies, it is each other.
Oh, absolutely they do. And it's such a good thing to
Yes.
get them fighting with each other. And it's not the hardest thing in the world to do either.
Yes.
Especially when
Yeah.
they spend as much time online as they do.
Mhm.
Some of these fights are amazing to watch because you don't even know some of the principles involved. You're looking at it and you're like, oh, these people are mad at some Twitch streamer over this. Okay. Yeah, keep going with that, please.
I mean, for the past 3 weeks, we got to watch a full-scale war between Groypers and Jordan Peterson.
Mm-hmm.
And it was great.
Oh, yeah. Get the popcorn.
Absolutely hilarious. And, it's, and we can take some instructive information here about how fragile these guys are, especially once they actually get access to power, because that's when things really start to fracture.
Yep.
I mean, the alt-right, as we understand it, completely disintegrated in 2017 in the wake of Charlottesville.
Absolutely, it did.
I mean, it was already falling apart prior to Charlottesville, really after the deplorable and Heilgate and, guys like Richard Spencer throwing Hitler salutes and, your Mike Cernovich is thinking, oh, we can totally keep the alt-right going just without the Nazis. Like, no, it was the Nazis from the very beginning.
Mm-hmm. The optics wars and all of that.
Exactly, yeah. So that is something that, may work in democracy's advantage, because as we've kind of learned quite a bit by looking at not just, far right people, but people across the political spectrum, right? It's really easy to be ideologically consistent from a point of opposition.
Right.
But once you start handing out access to actual power, that's when divisions start to turn into rivalries. And those disagreements can boil over into things that can, again, completely shatter a political coalition.
And every day that they have to work together, the more likely that is to happen.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I think all we can really do at this point in the game is turn out in the numbers that we can to vote for the people that are not Trump.
Yeah.
That are running. Yeah. And cross your fingers that this coalition is going to fracture on them, because I think you really are starting to see, the cracks in it right now. And like I said, if it falls apart, I think they're going to have a cycle of recriminations that are going to be really hard to come back from. And that's kind of my hope, is that one more loss and they're going to realize that Trump is not a national candidate.
Correct.
That you're never going to be able to run a guy like that and win a national election with him as your leader. And you're going to see the Republican Civil War that's been brewing go kinetic at that point.
Yeah, because fundamentally, if the GOP can't win this year, they are incapable of winning.
Right.
Because they could not ask for a better landscape. You have a weak incumbent president. You have a lot of political pressure stemming from both economic conditions. Again, at the end of the day, like, inflation is always bad for incumbents, right?
Yes.
When the price of food, fuel, and housing is high, the people in charge are going to be unpopular. You have additional pressure stemming from other parts of his coalition due to foreign policy blunders, whether we're talking about the withdrawal from Afghanistan, the continued support of Israel, Gaza.
He has definitely done some stuff that has not made him real popular in certain quarters at all.
No, not at all. Not at all. And again, if it really speaks to the fact that if the GOP can't win here, and I think in their heart of hearts, they kind of understand this, is if this is as good a shot as we're going to get.
Right.
Because after this cycle, the actual national bench for Democrats is actually pretty robust.
Oh, yeah.
There's a pretty high number of what I would call fairly high octane candidates who are waiting to step onto the national stage, whether we're talking about like Gretchen Whitmer in Michigan, J.B. Pritzker. I'm a big believer that Kelly in Arizona is being slept on as someone who could easily be elected president.
I've had Josh Shapiro, your governor, on my radar for a couple of years.
Josh Shapiro, my home state governor as well. Like, we're seeing really that old, and let's be frank, highly unpopular wing of what's left of the 90s and late 80s neoliberal Democratic establishment. They're on their way out. They don't want to be on their way out, but Father Time is seeing them out one way or another. And I really do think that in their heart of hearts, a lot of Republicans know that this is our window.
Yes.
This is it. I mean, they already got the scare in 2022 when the fact that they weren't able to turn 2022 into an electoral bloodbath for the Democrats is outrageous.
And they absolutely should have, but here we are.
Exactly. Yeah, they got dealt the most winning hand imaginable. You had spiking inflation, the highest we've seen in the past 4 years. We were fresh off the withdrawal from Afghanistan. Like, the Democrats were in disarray, literally.
Should have been a slam dunk, and it wasn't.
Should have been a slam dunk, and they biffed it. They completely biffed it. And, I mean, you could see how embarrassed they were.
Mm-hmm. And at least part of that is because, they've nominated one terminally online weirdo after another to run for office. And they have proven with the Vance pick that they just haven't learned from that mistake. No. You can't let, your Charlie Kirks or your Steve Bannons pick your candidates, because if you do, you're going to end up with these people that only appeal to the people who listen to War Room.
Yeah, and it's kind of an interesting trend that we've seen for a really long time, in that the primary electorates for the two political parties are almost mirror images of each other, right? In that the people who turn out for Republican primaries tend to be the most hard right conservative people, right? That's effectively what allowed the Tea Party takeover in 2010.
Yes.
Whereas the primary electorate for the Democrats tend to be the moderate wing and establishment wing of the party. So people who come out of Democratic primaries tend to be these more centrist, middle of the road candidates, whereas increasingly, or at least since 2010, the folks who are coming out of the GOP primaries tend to be these hardcore ideologues. And it just has resulted in one unforced error after another. I mean, as evidenced by the fact that when they finally got the ability to govern the House, I mean,
they just couldn't do it.
It's hard to think of a more embarrassing political episode than Kevin McCarthy on the floor of the House losing vote after vote after vote, when Nancy Pelosi was able to skate by with, a 2-vote majority for the better part of a decade.
Yeah.
Yeah. And as you say, like, when you continually put these weirdos into the offices of power that they don't really have any intention of using, you're going to keep running into this.
And it's really not going to change for them anytime soon, because if you look at the GOP bench, what you were saying about the staffers are these young Gen Z guys that are super, super, super fascist. Yeah. And if you look at what's coming up on the bench for the GOP, who's that candidate that can win a national election that's coming out?
Yeah, absolutely. Let's say, again, we're moving into a 2028 election after a second Trump term, assuming that Trump steps aside, which, I can't see that he would be able to finagle another run. The idea of J.D. Vance being winning a national election? Oh my God. Oh my God. Give me a break.
Vance might be the worst national candidate that's ever run.
If we're including every various GOP primary candidate, yeah, he'd be up there. I think we could probably dig deep and find some more bananas folks. I'd have to think, though.
But not at this level.
Oh, not at this level.
Not that have ever gotten to the point where it's a serious consideration that they could run for president and get their party's nomination. I mean, Herman Cain was funny, but
exactly.
RIP, but there's no,
he was a meme candidate for the start. Yeah,
seriously.
Exactly.
He's never going to get the nomination.
Exactly. And I think in that regard, that would be about as ludicrous a national candidate as possible. Again, I'm not going to say that he couldn't win because for obvious reasons, I'm not in the business of making those predictions anymore.
Right. Weird shit happens, but
weird
still.
shit happens, and we can only get burned so many times before we learn our lessons. Like, maybe we should stop.
Right.
Maybe we should stop tempting fate like this. Well, let's do that, and maybe we'll get some more more positive outcomes.
Right. Andy, thank you so much for coming on today. I really appreciate your time.
My pleasure. Thanks so much for having me back.
Thank you for helping me, walk through some of what we've seen people freaking out about, and hopefully they can look at it and say, yeah, this is scary, but it's probably not going to happen that way.
Yeah, exactly. And this should never be taken as a call to, complacency or these various, puff pieces of like, oh, Trump second term be fine, blah, blah, blah. No, like there are some legitimately very bad outcomes on the table, but we should be clear-eyed as to what those outcomes would look like. And, if we are clear-eyed about that, that's how we can best prepare and respond to them.
Right. And we should definitely remind everybody as well that you need to vote in November.
Yeah.
You need to get out there and do it.
I had someone ask me today, like, what can we do in the meantime? It's like, it's all going to rest on turnout. I still think that this is going to be a pretty low turnout election. That's what happens when the two guys at the top of the ticket are both really unpopular.
Yep.
And so literally every vote is going to count. None of this like, oh, I live in a safe state. Nope. Get out there and vote.
Out there and vote.
Get out there and vote. Vote up and down the ticket, because it's not just about the president. It's about congressional representative. It's about your local representatives, your state representatives,
your state attorney general, everything else that comes up.
Everything up and down that ballot. Get out there and be voting.
And one other thing I'd like to point out, if you need to turn it off for a while and not wade in the daily news cycle, I think that's fine. Just remember to show up and vote in November.
And that's the perfect note, I think, to end this on. Like, it's so important to, not let yourself drown in the noise.
Yep.
Like, just because you're disconnecting for hours, days, even weeks, that doesn't mean you're forgetting about all
you're going to show up and vote. And honestly, that's the most important thing you can do.
Yeah, you can talk to your friends and make sure people are turning out without logging on to Twitter or without logging on to TikTok or anything like that. Never be afraid to just take some time. You know what? I'm going to step away from this. I'm going to go take a walk. I'm going to go watch some TV. Do literally anything else. I feel like there is, this self-imposed burden of like, I need to be following all this stuff all the time. No, you don't.
Not at all. You don't.
You really don't. And even people like us who do this kind of stuff for a living, we're not even following it all the time.
Nope. The world's going to go on without you.
I haven't watched the RNC at all, and it's been great.
I know.
Great. I can't recommend it highly enough. How about you just don't watch it?
I'm going to take an entire weekend and I am going to work and referee at a jiu-jitsu tournament, and I'm not going to look at any of those.
Yeah, brother. Oh, yeah.
Forget it. Not doing it.
Gonna be awesome. Gonna be awesome.
Again, Andy, thank you. Really appreciate your time today, and it's great talking to you again. We'll have you on again soon.
Sounds great, man.
Thank you very much, and you take care. Thanks for listening to the Did Nothing Wrong podcast. If you want to hear more, you can find us on the web at didnothingwrongpod.com. Please make sure you subscribe to get our content straight into your inbox. You can also follow us on Twitter at GrizaBJJ, GRZABJJ, as well as DNWPod. We're extremely grateful for paid subscriptions and donations that allow us to keep doing this important work. Thanks, and remember, everyone mentioned did nothing wrong.